everybody. Happy Friday. Happy sprint weekend qualifying day. Rob, we've got a lot to cover today.
Adam, great to be back. It's my first deadline stream in a few races now. We had that one last week, but that was at the crack of dawn, so I wouldn't necessarily include that. Really exciting hour ahead. I think there's a lot to cover. A really interesting practice session we just had a short while ago, and a lot of different dilemmas we're grappling with. So really excited to get stuck in and address all the questions that I can already see are coming through in the chat, which is good.
Absolutely. So just a procedural note, on the show, we're going to talk about our thoughts from FP1. We'll be here to review any lineups that you want us to check out. We found that typing them into the chat could be a little bit cumbersome, so feel free to head over to our base in FanAmp, drop a screenshot of your lineup there, and our producer will put it into a slide for Rob and I to share and review on the air. We can also go through the chat here to go through some of your questions as well. And then Rob and I will lock in our lineups for the Qatar Grand Prix. Then we'll pick a winner for our contest this week. While you're in our FanAmp base dropping your lineups for this week, tell us who you think is going to score the most points, Carlos Sainz or Sergio Perez. You'll win a chance. You'll win $50 toward our sponsor, fifthgeargarms.com, and the opportunity to rename either my team or Rob's team, whichever one you prefer. Our current team names are down below under our pictures. And then lastly, as promised, Rob will be doing a shoey. And so he's been carefully observing the results of the polls that you've all been answering this week. And so we'll save the best for last. All right. Free practice one, it's very tricky on a sprint weekend. You don't have a whole lot of information to go off of. There's one session, and this track was a particularly big mess. Winds got up to 35 miles an hour during the session. It's blowing dirt and sand all over the track. You heard a lot of complaints from Verstappen. Leclerc was off the track quite a bit. Albon looked completely lost in the session. I think he came on radio and said it felt like the rear was disconnected from the rest of the car. So a lot to try to consume in that one session.
Yeah, really messy 60 minutes of practice, to be honest. I was going into that with the expectation that I didn't want to use that as really a major yardstick to guide my decision making. Obviously, there were some times that a few people put in towards the end of the session that kind of just reaffirmed my decision and stance on certain drivers. But from the outset, as you said, there were complaints over the radio. I was a little skeptical whether we'd actually see optimal car performance across the board. And I think as the session wore on, I guess the drivers got a little bit more comfortable. The conditions maybe improved just a little bit. So, we can see here on the screen, no major surprises, in my opinion. Maybe a couple of drivers in the top 10 that wouldn't ordinarily be there. But, mostly kind of in line with my expectations. The big surprise for me was actually Fernando Alonso, because I didn't expect Aston Martin to do all that well heading in. But again, it's only one practice, right?
Yeah, Fernando looked strong really throughout the whole session. They had some fast runs in the first 20 minutes of FP1. He looked good then. Then after a lot of track evolution, they did some pretty obviously qualifying simulations, and Alonso looked great there too. And as a reminder, Alonso finished P3 in the last time they raced here in Qatar in 2021 in an Alpine that really had no business on the podium. So this is a track that Fernando's clearly comfortable with. And also, since we raced here in 2021, the track has been resurfaced. So I think there's definitely a feeling out period for that. And then there's the introduction of some new curbs. So drivers really testing the limits of where can I cheat the limits of the track without causing some damage to the floor of the car. So yeah, a lot of things all going down in just an hour.
Yeah, very much so. And I guess also really interestingly, in the last Grand Prix, a couple of drivers blew out their tyres on those curbs. So hopefully we don't see quite the same problem we encountered a couple of years ago. But just going back to Alonso just quickly, I think what stood out to me was that he set that time on the medium tyre as well. So considering most of the drivers did set their time on softs, which are towards the end of the session anyway, the fact that he's, top four just in that 60 minutes of practice is surprisingly encouraging. Again, I'm not going to entertain him for my own team this weekend, but definitely probably the surprise package for me out of the names we can see on the timesheet here.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of factors that give me reason to believe we're going to have some surprises in qualifying coming up. So this is a very high evolution track. Plus, you're trying to clear that sand out. So there's a very good chance that it comes down to that last flyer. And if you time it wrong, if there's a red flag that this spoils your lap, you could really find some surprise drivers out in Q1 or Q2 and set us up for an interesting race on Sunday.
Definitely.
Let's cut over to some of the questions in the chat. So Mads asked, can you go through when to use the remaining chips if someone has all 6 of them? So I would think that between Limitless, 3X, you need to use probably both of those in one of the 3 sprints in the next 4 races. Let me spitball this. Maybe 3X at Coda, Limitless at Brazil, because that's usually where your more expensive teams are looking really good. Wild card when you suspect you're going to start taking -8 points or more, but as you get toward the end of the year, even saving yourself -4 is helpful there. And then autopilot and final fix can be a bit of a crapshoot based on what you're seeing lay out in front of you for the week.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that for the most part. I think autopilot, interestingly, might come into effect at a circuit like Las Vegas, where we haven't raced that before at that stage of the year, the second last race on the calendar, much like the view we've taken for Brazil, where Mercedes we expect will be a lot stronger there. There could be a couple of surprise packages in the mix where George Russell, for instance, if he's at that similar price to Sainz, Leclerc, Perez, could be an alternative to pivot in. So I think autopilot could be nice at Vegas, maybe Mexico, but yeah. And then final fix is largely team dependent on how you think a driver is expected to perform on the race versus someone else in qualifying. Wildcard, yeah, I think it's just when you're taking hits, and the other two I agree with for the most part too.
And for autopilot, I would say wait for a weekend where maybe Max or another top driver are taking an engine penalty. We're pretty far into the season. I'm surprised we're not seeing more top drivers taking engine penalties. I think if Max takes one, he falls to the bottom of the grid, that autopilot could be a hedge if he can't climb all the way back up the grid. If another top driver in your lineup, like a Perez or Lando, takes the grid penalty, you're hedging against them successfully moving up the field, getting all those overtake points, and then maybe a driver of the day for their credit so that they jump over Max. So some interesting options, but you do need to let it play out a little bit. I don't think there's an obvious choice quite yet. Las Vegas is probably the only one that stands out to me otherwise.
Yeah, I think you can certainly make a case for, the 3X or the Limitless here. I guess we've set out our reasons why there's perhaps a time to wait, but there is people like Mads, for instance, that may have, quite a few in their pocket to use. So if you feel compelled to use it here, then go for it. I mean, Ferrari, both drivers look sensational through that 60 minutes of practice. But I think because so many of us have double Red Bull at least, double McLaren at least, the opportunity to be different maybe isn't quite as much as it would be with Mercedes and Ferrari on the table.
Great. Let's head over. I think we have our first submission over in our lineup review. So this one is from Checo Fan over on FanAmp. And so it looks like they're running a Ferrari heavy lineup, no Red Bull, which is interesting. Rob, what do you think when you first take a look at this?
I think you've got all the right pieces for many of the positions there, like Carlos Sainz, McLaren constructor, even Oscar Piastri. I think drivers like Lance Stroll, who, the last few races, we just haven't been convinced he's worthy of a position in our teams anymore. And then Albon looked a little squirrely at various points in practice. I think he's a great driver in his own right, but the circuit, I just don't know if it's necessarily suited to the Williams. There's that pit lane straight just over 1 kilometer long, which I expect they will be able to make up some time, but it's some of the corners kind of at the top of the track that may not necessarily work in their favor. Keep in mind that some of these are higher speed corners, so they may not regress quite as much, but I wasn't convinced on the Williams there. So it's probably like Stroll and Albon for me that stand out as the glaring drivers I'd think about mixing up. And then Red Bull, obviously. Where do you get Max in though? I don't know. It looks like this team might be a bit short on budget.
Yeah, I just did some quick math on the budget. It looks like they're sub 100 million. So this strikes me as a team that maybe came in the second half of the season, maybe had a rough go in the first few races, and now they're well behind the teams that are in the 120s like the rest of us. So a very different lineup review. I would recommend basically sacrificing wherever you can to get Verstappen in at this point. Maybe if you've already got a piece of Sainz as a driver, dropping the Ferrari constructor to something lower, or taking Sainz and either Albon and Stroll out of your lineup and then trying to get Max and then some of the lower drivers. I think I'd rather have Max and a collection of budget drivers than an even flow of drivers that are in that mid to lower tier.
Yeah, I agree. Max is the auto DRS boost, and you're really with a team like this, there are parts, as I said, that are good, but you're essentially hoping Max doesn't drive well or doesn't finish to completely go against the grain with him there. So as an auto DRS lock for me, you'd have to compromise, I think, on Ferrari and Stroll and Albon as you're they're probably the scapegoats for me in this situation. Again, without having a team there, it's hard to kind of tinker a bit, but I think that's the general consensus.
That makes sense. Let's take a look at one more here. And this is from Dennis Z0710 on FanAmp. So now he's got the Verstappen, McLaren, Ferrari base that I would have expected here. And then this looks like another lower budget team because his number 2 driver in this case would be Piastri, and then the 3 budget drivers. This looks pretty good to me. I like Alfa Romeo and AlphaTauri both brought upgrades this week. So Yuki and Zhou, I feel pretty good about them. Piastri has been tremendous both in terms of points scored and budget increase. And then Hülkenberg, I'm a little bit worried about because Haas tends to eat tires. This is a track that eats tires. I have low hopes for him, but also you're probably budget constrained by the time you get down there. So it's either him or Logan Sargent, and the guy's on negative points for the season. So can't recommend Logan for really anybody's budget at this point.
I think with the funds available, you're doing as well as you can. You've got a piece of the Ferrari, given they both drove quite well in practice. Max, we expect, will dominate this weekend. And if you're thinking Perez may fall off the pace a little bit, then I think this is the optimal build with the funds available. The only thought I'd maybe think about, given the point you made on Hülkenberg and the Haas tire degradation, is I think they might just have enough to get up to Liam Lawson. And in his last race out, you're hoping he puts in a good final performance to really kind of set the tone for what people expect from him into the future.
You know, you bring up a good point on Lawson, something I've been asked a lot. Should we sub in Liam Lawson this week? Something to consider is Danny Rick is almost definitely coming back for Coda in 2 weeks. So remember, you're going to use a transfer to get him in, and you're going to have to use a transfer to get him out. So be mindful of that. If you're playing with a lot of different pieces in your lineup this week, and you're going to be taking -4, -8 for Coda, I don't think Liam Lawson is so transformational that he's worth all of that gymnastics on your lineup.
Yep. Great.
Let's jump into the Sainz and Perez debate, because it's not only the topic of this week's contest, but a lot of the questions in the chat are around this area of their lineup. And Rob, this is something that you had been tinkering with as you set your lineup. So last week you had Perez in, but then as a result, your budget driver, you were stuck with Sargent. When they both DNF'd, it led to a bit of a delta for you this week. And now Sainz gives you a bit more lineup flexibility. Could you talk a little bit about some of your decision-making on Perez versus Sainz for the week?
Yeah, look, I think it's a dilemma that quite a few people still haven't settled on. And I don't think one is necessarily streets ahead of the other in terms of fantasy production. I think I'm just more at ease going with a driver that I've seen through the last kind of 4, 5, 6 races drive competently and confidently. Carlos had that race win in Singapore. And even when, like last weekend in Japan, for instance, he wasn't at the front of the field, it was still a solid, points outing for him. I think he had something like 18 points, if my memory serves me right. So I just want that kind of reassurance that the driver I'm picking in that position is going to deliver, I guess, a sound result. I know you can make the case that Red Bull are going to thrive at a circuit with those higher speed corners and the straight, but just on all of the tire compounds I was watching throughout practice, I was particularly focused on Sainz and Perez, and Sainz just seemed to have the edge over him there. I think also the fact that Sargent, he'd finished P11 in practice, not discouraging by any means, but again, Tsunoda, I kind of much prefer if I have to choose between the two. Budget drivers are, as always, going to be a bit of a dilemma week in, week out. But I think if I had the budget to stretch to someone like Joe, he's probably my pick among all of them. And then Tsunoda, Lawson, and then kind of Hulkenberg, Sargent further down the order.
That's good. So I think we've answered Bo for Smurf and Christopher Ryback on the Sainz versus Perez item for you. I liked what I saw out of Perez in FP1. My heart says Sainz is going to have a better week, but I'm trying to stick with the data as much as I can. I haven't totally settled on my lineup yet. We could do that live when we pull the screen back up in a minute. The signs, well, I don't want to use the signs. The indicators that I should go with Perez are betting lines favor Perez to finish on the podium, and he has the third highest odds of winning the race after Verstappen and Lando. That Red Bull has been a rocket ship. It looks like they've corrected some of the setup woes that slowed them down in Singapore. And then also, I was optimistic about what I saw from Perez in that session. A lot of drivers struggling with turn 4, Leclerc going off repeatedly, Albon going off repeatedly. It looked like Perez had a good handle on that track. And so if he can stop himself from completely binning it in one of the qualifying sessions, he could be on the rails for a good week. I think the thing that has me struggling the most is I lost $500,000 on Perez in Japan. If I dump him and he has a good race and he gains that $500,000 back, I'm basically a million in the hole of trying to afford him again. And I'm worried that I've dug myself into a bit of a mess. But then also, I might just be perpetuating the same mistake week in and week out if Sainz outperforms him.
Yeah, I think it's a tough one, particularly when you take into account the price rises. A question I'd ask you is, I mean, yes, Perez could have a good race, but so could Sainz. And if Sainz goes up close to the same amount Perez does, given they're pretty much the same price now, it probably wouldn't realistically make that much of a difference. Hypothetically, if they both scored 30-odd points over the course of the weekend, then they might go up the same amount anyway. So I guess the thought process I'm kind of assessing myself is, yes, one might go up, but that doesn't necessarily the other one might as well. So it's just, it's a tough one, I think.
There's so much to consider. And as I look at the results of the poll, it looks like our audience is somewhat split too. Sainz 54%, Checo 45% out of 53 votes. So I would say we're fairly torn with a little bit of a lean toward Carlos Sainz. And remember, if you voted in this poll, please make sure you head over to our base on FanAmp and put it there. And for anyone who hasn't submitted yet, by all means, head on over. Also, feel free to drop your team while you're there. We'll put it over onto a slide and review it live on the stream.
All right. Should we go through a couple more questions in the chat? Because there have been a few we've covered, but I think there might be a few that we haven't as well.
Let's do it.
So, yeah, Checo, Sainz, we've answered that. I don't know if I necessarily answered Christopher's question. If you could afford Perez over Sainz, would you prefer him? I've said part of it had to do with the thinking of Sargent as my budget driver, but I think I'm just more encouraged by Sainz's results now and through practice. So I think if it's a toss-up between the two, it's for me, but we're splitting hairs at this point, given how close it was in the poll. What do you think the meta team is for this weekend, Adam? Is it triple Red Bull or close to triple McLaren and then the budget driver?
You bring up a funny point, because our friends over at F1 Fantasy Tools will always bail us out if we're at odds with each other on what the meta lineup is. Unfortunately, they haven't had a chance to get their sims up yet, at least as of 2 minutes before the hour when we came on. So we're left to our own devices. I think the meta lineup will be, assuming you have somewhere in the 120s for budget, Max, Sainz or Checo, Lando, Oscar, whatever budget driver you can afford. I think if you can afford them all, Zhou over Yuki, Lawson, or any others. And then for constructors, Red Bull, McLaren, possibly Ferrari, McLaren, if you want the budget to afford the rest. Yeah. What about you? Yeah. What do you think?
Pretty similar. It is. It's so cliche. We've talked about it before, but it's so team dependent and budget dependent. But I think the skeleton of any team should have Max and Red Bull, Lando and McLaren, and probably Oscar, and then figure out what's available to whether or not you can get Perez or Sainz or whatever budget you can stretch to. So, I think that's going to be the fixture for this week for the most part. Okay, what else have we got? We want to look at the polls.
Greg, I want to tease the shoey. So you had posted these polls. It's to set us up for today. The first one is, what liquid should I consume? And despite the evildoers that teamed up with me to put milk, beer, one out. And question number 2, what should I drink the chosen liquid out of? Right now, boot is winning. So do you have a beer and a boot handy?
I do. For those of you that have paid attention to my background, I've got a lineup of 3 different shoes behind me: the sneaker, the loafer, boot, and then obviously the Corona that was sitting in the back of my fridge, which has been neglected for a month or so. So I'll do my best to enjoy it as much as possible. But I've never had a shoey out of a boot before. I've done a sneaker and I've done a loafer or a boat shoe, but I think the boot looks like the winner here.
It reminds. Have you seen the movie Beer Fest? They have the big glass boot, and they have a vortex of beer that will splash you in the face if you don't turn it right at the right moment. But I don't think you'll be filling the boot all the way up. It'll just be a beer's worth.
Probably just spill down the front like it usually does. So very much looking forward to ripping it at some point. There's still plenty of time to vote. FanAmp have pinned my or not pinned, but dropped the link to that tweet in the chat. So if you want to submit a last minute vote to make me swing the vessel I drink out of one way or another, go vote.
Fantastic. How far down are we in the chat? Have we gotten to?
I think we've gone most of the way down. There's a couple we could probably just easily answer. Rad Pancakes asked Yuki or Nico. I think Yuki is Tsunoda for me this weekend.
Yes, I'm anti Haas, 1 because of the tire degradation, and 2, I can't trust a guy that tends to qualify high and lose places that could do it twice between the sprint and the Grand Prix.
I think a slightly more difficult one that Christopher's asked is between Liam Lawson and Yuki Tsunoda. I think they're both very good fantasy options at that price point. It is tough for me to say Lawson in this case because Yuki has raced here once before, back in 2021. Whether that actually edges it all that much, I'm not so sure. But I know this season particularly hasn't been overly great for Yuki at some of the sprint races, but he has had a couple of sprint performances last year where I was quite impressed with how he drove. A very different circuit to Qatar, obviously, but I think he's the pick out of the 2 AlphaTauri drivers for me.
Yeah, for me, I think they're both about equal for me this week. Normally, I would avoid a rookie, but Lawson carries this really mature approach about him. I think he's avoided a lot of the rookie mistakes that we saw even in Yuki's early days. So I wouldn't advise against Lawson if you already have him. I think they're equal enough that you'd be happy with either. I would just advise against bringing Lawson in if you had Tsunoda, because then it's a transfer to get him in, a transfer to get him out for what I think is equal footing. I haven't heard anything to suggest that the AlphaTauri upgrades would go to one driver or the other. So I think it's equal machinery. So I call it a coin flip.
Yeah. Fair enough. Fair enough. I think there's a few questions around the 3 times and the limitless in the chat. Do you want to go through Mike's lineup on your screen before we deliberate chips once more?
And so I think Mike is probably happy we just had that chat about Lawson, because he has what I think most of us would consider the meta, triple McLaren, triple Red Bull with Lawson, with basically no more money left over. So his choices are probably Lawson or Yuki, or really rolling the dice. So Mike, I'd say you're fine with either of them in my case, unless you're considering anything else to move around. Perez versus Sainz, that would be how much you believe my arguments versus Rob's, but I don't think there's any wrong answer out of those.
I agree. We can't really. I think we're at this point, it's a coin flip, and go with what you think is expected to do well, and that's for me Sainz. So just because I picked him doesn't necessarily mean people who roll with Perez is wrong.
Good. I'm seeing a few more lineups come in. Let's do one more. This is Ziggy Jam. Check this out. So this looks like a limitless team. I see the infinity sign in the corner there. So triple Ferrari, triple Red Bull, Fernando Alonso. Ooh,
tasty.
And this is a good segue, because you wanted to get back into limitless. And what do we think for this weekend? I think if I was to change anything, I might change Alonso for Lando. I think we've seen not only consistently good performance from Lando, odds makers give him pretty good odds to finish on the podium this weekend. McLaren traditionally gain, well, I guess it doesn't matter if they gain value using the limitless chip. I think even though I've seen some inspiring runs out of Fernando today, I think I would go a little bit safer with Lando on the limitless. What about you, Rob?
I think it's got all the makings of a great limitless team. It is hard not to ignore Alonso's practice performance, particularly that P4 was on the medium, as we mentioned before. But I think McLaren, I'm not going to say they were sandbagging, but I still think there's a lot more performance to unlock in that car on this circuit. And just because Oscar and Lando were 9th and 10th respectively doesn't give me enough of a reason to completely disregard them. I think otherwise it's pretty strong. But I think for me, the reason why I'm not inclined to use limitless this week is because I want to wait, as we've talked about, for a race where outside of Max, all of these other drivers and constructors on a coin flip. So I mean, ideally the team I would have is when Lewis and George are 1 and 2 in the practice sessions, and Mercedes constructor is the goods, because they are very low owned for their price. So I can't fault you for using a chip here, particularly if you've got, a few left and you're not sure between this Interlagos and Circuit of the Americas, which circuit you want to use that at.
Yeah, it's an interesting conundrum if you have multiple chips left, because if you save one for Coda and one for Interlagos, and God forbid it rains at one of those tracks, then all of a sudden we encourage you to wait for more certainty, and then it becomes a less certain race. So there is some risk to deferring, but that's where I'm leading right now. And I think similarly, I see Dan in the chat asking if he should use 3X. I think the 3X is quite obvious that Max is going to deliver with that chip. But what I struggle with is then where do you move your 2X to? We've been having this debate about Sainz versus Perez. Lando's in this mix too. There's just enough uncertainty. It would be nice to wait a little bit until there's a really obvious number 2. Either Perez regains his form, or him and Sainz fall off and it's clearly Lando. I'd try to aim for a little bit more safety with the 2X.
Look, I think if you have the belief that someone like Perez or Sainz is going to be around P2 the entire weekend, then absolutely go for it, because the 2 times really boils down to who you think is going to score the highest that weekend. And and yes, it's quite open at the moment, because I think we could probably see 3 or 4 or 5 different drivers coming second behind Max this weekend. But it is a question that I'm continuing to ask myself, like, who and when is that number 2 driver going to stand out and deliver the results? I'm not entirely sure for me if it's this weekend, but if, as I said, if you're confident in, say, Carlos Sainz, then throw it on him.
I like
Orlando.
it.
Orlando, as Mike's called out.
This is going to be an interesting weekend. There are some records that could come down. Obviously, Max is just a few points away from locking up his 3rd driver's title. He'd be the first champion to secure his title on a sprint weekend. He'd also be the 2nd youngest driver after Seb to secure a 3-peat. So a lot of good news for Max. And if he only leads 28 laps on Sunday, he will have broken Seb's record for most laps led in a season. So a lot of good stuff on tap for Max with a strong performance on Sunday.
Yeah, I think he's going to really want to come out of the block strong, lock up that drivers by the time the sprint rolls around. It's P6. And yeah, I just can't see him being beaten at all this weekend. Although I wouldn't be surprised if we do have an outsider win the sprint. Is Lando or Charles a shout there? Interestingly, one of the commentators on F1 TV during practice said that all of Charles' front row starts have been on sprint weekends this season, if I'm not mistaken. So could be a bit of an omen for Charles if he comes through in qualifying.
And on the records you don't want to have list, if Kevin Magnussen fails to lead a lap in this race, he will tie our friend Martin Brundle for most Grand Prix starts without having ever led a Grand Prix. I think it's like 158. So fingers crossed that K-Mag finds himself in a crazy scenario and avoids that dubious honor. Ooh, good question in the chat from John. It's either John J or John. So forgive me if I pronounce you wrong. Is there a driver of the day bias if Max wins the championship? That's a good question, right? Because the viewers typically skew toward non-Max, no matter how impressive he is. They just like the variety. So if Lando looks good, Carlos looks good, they're more of a driver of the day nod. I think it's going to depend a little bit on the broadcast. If they can really milk how amazing it is that Verstappen has won this early in the season, it's the 2nd earliest someone's ever locked up a title. If they can really milk it, I think there could be some bias toward Max driver of the day.
Yeah, great question. I hadn't even thought about that, but even more of a reason to put your 2 times on Max or get him into your team for those low budget teams that we reviewed earlier. It is. Yeah, they are very sentimental when it comes to voting for driver of the day. So if we do see someone like Fernando, who's pretty much been a non-factor for the most part in the second half of the season, suddenly surge through, I have every expectation he could come away with that 10-point bonus come the end of the weekend. But a good point by Mike, even though if he does win on the Saturday, like, that doesn't really implicate his driver of the day performance or points on the Sunday. So who knows? He could, for whatever reason, struggle on Saturday and then have a blinder on Sunday, and that's where he wraps it up. But I think it's a foregone conclusion that the sprint is where he closes out the championship.
I am Groot says, love you guys. Love you too, Groot. Big fan of the new Guardians movie.
I didn't think I was that much of a fan, to be honest. This could be a controversial opinion, but I think they've got progressively worse over the 3. So I struggled to get through the most recent one, and the second one I wasn't a huge fan of either. So just got a soft spot for the first one, and that's it.
Maybe we should keep you away from the Guardians Christmas special from last year. Who knows what you'd think about that?
Yeah, I've seen it on Disney Plus. I'm not. Oh, sorry, when I say seen it, I've scrolled over it. Not watched it though, so we will see.
Don't kill my Marvel buzz. I'm getting ready to watch Loki tonight.
Oh yeah, no, I haven't. I'm a huge Marvel fan. Just Guardians, I'm maybe not so keen on.
Hey, that's fine. That's fine. Brian in the chat says, I'm stuck budget-wise and can't choose Sainz or Lando. Can't get them both. Ooh, this is interesting because the other piece of F1 Fantasy Tools not giving us a sim that we're missing is price gain predictions. And Lando has been consistently, I think, a little bit better than Carlos at delivering budget. He's now the number 6 driver for both points and points per million, so a determinant of value. I don't know if I'm just anti-Carlos or what this week, but I would probably lean toward Lando. But for people that are considering him versus Perez, I imagine a lot of folks would be leaning towards Sainz. What about you, Rob?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think as we talked about, the practice times maybe not solely representative of what McLaren can do here. I fully expect both Oscar and Lando to be close to the top 5 or in the top 5 come qualifying. So it really boils down to, as boring as a response is, who you think will perform well and who you think will score the most, because obviously those price rises are tied to the performance of the drivers fantasy-wise each week. If I'm choosing between the two, I think Sainz is probably, look, I say this reluctantly, I think Sainz might do well in the sprint, but over the course of an entire race, I think Lando and McLaren might just have the full race pace. And I know we say every single week, oh, look, Ferrari's tyre degradation is going to be a worry, but we haven't really seen that as much as I probably would have expected the last few races, because the car performance has really delivered. And I think now at the point where we are, what we've seen from Ferrari, they're mixing it up at the top. And yes, tyre degradation can be a factor, but I don't think it's quite as much of a factor as we maybe are making it out to be. So between the two, probably Sainz, but I did say Sainz. I don't know. It's tough. I'm going to say Sainz, but watch me be wrong come Sunday night.
And I think you were starting to get to it at the end. Ferrari has the opportunity to shut me up when it comes to my criticisms of how they're handling tire degradation. I think they did a really good job of managing it in Japan. And if they can handle it 2 races in a row on tracks that are known for carving up tires, I've got to really break them apart in my head from the sorts of criticisms I give Haas in this area.
Definitely.
We're just a few minutes away from locking the Shoey poll. So if anybody has any more thoughts on what you're going to suggest Rob drinks out of and drinks, get over to his Twitter page to take a look at that. Speaking of Rob's Twitter page, this is his lineup. Rob, do you want to talk us through your selection?
Yeah, I think we've definitely covered most of it already. For me, it was the dilemma, for those of you that aren't across my team from the week prior, Perez and Sargent versus Carlos Sainz and Yuki Tsunoda. I think I saw enough through that 60 minutes of practice to go with my gut on Carlos, and it was who I was leaning towards the entire week. I think that, as I've just said before, the performance of that Ferrari is very encouraging, and I think they'll be in the mix for podiums across the weekend. It is a toss-up, a 50-50 on Sainz and Perez, but again, Sargent's kind of discouraging form, DNF risk at a circuit he's not been at before, in conditions which proved to be problematic a little bit in practice and could well affect in the race, was enough for me to want to go for Sainz and Tsunoda. And I'm pretty confident on this lineup heading into the weekend, but I wish my budget was a little higher, because I feel like I'm falling behind the pack just a little bit each week.
No, that's fair. But I mean, luckily with, I think, what do we have, 6 races left, you're reaching a point where maybe budget's less impactful because there's less of a horizon to worry about. So I get why budget is falling off the table as a top reason why you'd pick one driver versus another, for sure. Yeah,
definitely. Speaking of lineups, I was going to say we've got a few more to review, and do you want to close those out as the last ones to review?
Let's do it. Yeah. And while I head over there, I just noticed the end of the poll. Are you using the 3X chip this weekend? It looks like 75-25 aren't using it. But I think part of it is because so many of us used our 3X already. So that's that could be a driver for it. Not that they don't want to use it, so they don't have it to use.
Mm. Yeah, I'm in that camp.
And so
don't have it to use.
I moused over to my team, so I'll spit this out before we go back to the last lineup reviews. I'm basically in a similar spot as Rob, but made a different decision for it, where if we can do this in real time. If I sub Perez out for Carlos Sainz, I only have 5.9 million left in budget. And now, let's sort by value. I still can't afford an upgrade over Yuki. So it's really, am I starting Sainz or am I starting Perez? So because he doesn't afford me any extra lineup flexibility, I'm really worried about him gaining that 0.5 million back. I'm going to roll with the exact same lineup that I put out there for Japan. Okay, now let's go over to the lineups. Got two. Oh, we haven't talked about Robbie's yet here. So this is a team. It looks like he's going Lando as the number 2 driver, going off of the strong performance of Fernando, and then going with the overtake merchant, as Rob calls him, and Zhou Guanyu.
I like this team. I guess budget is the topic of conversation at the moment. The only option I could really see is maybe getting, I don't know, what do you think of Zhou versus Albon? Because there is 3.8 that's just sitting there. I don't know necessarily if it's something that we need to give thought to about having all that money sitting on the side. I think you went up one screen, Adam.
Oh, did I? I'm sorry. Let's fix that.
Yeah. It was. Did we cover the team above? It looks like we're covering 2 teams. They're exactly the same. They're exactly the same. These 2. Yeah, I think I'm pretty like for the budget available. It looks like a great team. I think Zhou versus Albon is probably the only one I'd think about maybe mixing up, but I'm not so sure if you're wanting to take a punt on Albon, who had his moments in practice, and then I don't know. I mean, the higher speed corners probably work in favor of the Williams a little better than some of the slower speed corners at other circuits, but you're really hoping if you're going with Zhou here that he qualifies quite low, and same again for Albon. So it's a coin flip. Otherwise, the other 6 slots I'm pretty happy with for this team.
I think that's definitely one way to go. If you want it to be slightly safer, maybe hedge your bets with McLaren if you're worried about if one of them has an incident hitting you both on the driver line and the constructor line. Possibly, I think you could afford Sainz from Norris, and then you're just diversifying a little bit with another guy that's been in the conversation as being a top driver this weekend. But otherwise, this lineup looks really strong.
Yeah, I think we covered the same team on the slide below too. So,
yes.
F1
but thanks
MX.
to F1 MX for dropping your team in. Glad we were able to kill 2 birds with 1 stone there.
Yeah, definitely.
And then we've got this last one, VV Simon. So so the first team is the one that we just covered, and then the one on the right actually is the one you suggested. It's Albon instead of Zhou.
Yeah. What's your take on Albon this weekend? Because I guess I've given my 2 cents, albeit maybe not super informed with only 60 minutes, but I'm curious to get your side.
The little I know I don't like with Albon this week, I've still in my head is this quote from him. When was it? Right around Singapore or so, when he said, basically, don't expect anything out of me until Vegas. These next string of races, I don't expect to do terribly well in. And then he went to Singapore and had a decent race, and then he DNF'd in Japan. So I'm not sure if he was playing possum or if this is really what to expect from him. But he was miserable in FP1. And so do we want to overreact to that? I would probably take the high road and stay away from Albon and I'd go with team 1 on the screen here.
Yep.
Good.
Aligned. All right. So we got 15 minutes left. For those of you that haven't locked in your teams yet, get them penciled in right now. Adam's obviously going with the team he had last week, and I've brought in Sainz and Sonoda for Perez and Sargent. Oh, we've got one more. I mean, that's template. That's pretty template. I like that a lot. And I think Mike had the same team, Barcelona, for Lawson. So,
and that's the exact same team I'm running. So,
and that's
chef's
your team,
kiss. Love that team.
You can't really say too much to the contrary on that team if that's what you're going with, Adam. So, cool,
Fantastic.
Cool. One question that Robbie DMR posted in the chat was, should I yeet the no negative on the sprint race weekend? I think it's a no for me for sprint races. That's an easy answer for me because I think typically drivers won't DNF twice over the course of an entire weekend. So if you were to do it on a weekend like this one, where you DNF in the sprint, but you don't in the race, those points you score on Sunday are going to offset the -20 or the negative points attributed to your totals. So I guess the gain to be made is on using the no negative is not quite as high as you would at a circuit like Las Vegas or Mexico or Abu Dhabi. So I think save the no negative for one of those 3 races where they're not sprints. And Vegas in particular, a circuit we've not been at before, although it is just a rectangle pretty much, could be a good opportunity. And Mexico could be an option too, but not a sprint race for me.
Got it. And I think back to your point earlier about autopilot and using these hedge chips in Vegas. I foresee Vegas being one of 2 things. Either everyone's so tentative that it's a bit of a procession around the circuit, or it's going to be complete chaos and really nothing in the middle. So if I still had no negative, I would be eyeing Vegas as the time to use it. Going through a couple last questions in the chat here. Tahir asks, Perez and Sargent or Sainz and Tsunoda? I think he's found the exact question to get me off my position on Perez. If I have to be saddled with Logan Sargent, give me Carlos Sainz and Yuki.
Yeah, well, that's who I went with, and Sargent was the common denominator for the case to be made to go without this weekend. So Sainz, Tsunoda for me.
F1 Fantasy Tools did an interesting study last week to see how bad would Logan Sargent be if last year's drivers had the 2023 rules applied to them. Would he be as bad as Nicholas Latifi? Turns out Latifi and Albon would have been worse. 2022, Latifi and Albon would be worse than 2023 Sargent in the fantasy game.
Albon had a stinker last year. I think he had like 5 DNFs or something like that, which is absolutely insane. I mean, Ocon's had the same this year just about. So, and he's still scoring more points than Sargent. But I think the scoring system is probably weighted more towards Sargent this year because of the fact that you can score points for overtakes and positions gained, which we didn't have in the game the previous year. So that's probably helped him out just a little bit.
All right. We've got 1 minute left until the contest closes, and I've got to get my act together. So if you have 1 minute left, if anybody wants to weigh in on the Sainz Perez debate over on FanAmp, we have a live spreadsheet where our producers are feeding it into me so I don't miss anybody. Got 24 entries right now.
And get those votes in for the shoey, because that Corona, that room temperature Corona is looking very appetizing out of a Timberland boot. So assuming the boot is still the front runner, I haven't looked at the polls for a little while, but it's that's the way it was going a short while ago.
Rob is about to have the lunch of champions.
Oh, that should be fun.
All right. So I am just going to take all of our entries and plop them into the wheel of names. Rob, are we ready to spin?
Spin the wheel, Adam.
Away we go. I just blew up my screen, so it might look funky on your side. There we go. Let me fix that.
Looks fine to me.
Okay, I want to... Should we get... Can Robbie win 2 weeks in a row? Are we allowing that? We should do a quick tribunal on this.
That's tough. That's not, I guess, yeah, I think personally do another one. I know Robbie's obviously not going to be too pleased with that, but I think we want a new winner every week to give everyone the opportunity that enters. I think, however, you can win. I'd happily be corrected on this one, but I think You can't win 2 weeks in a row, but you can win multiple times. How about that?
Yes. And how about this? Do you want to agree to go one step further? Robbie can change the other team name for next week. So whoever we roll right now will pick a team, and then Robbie can get the other team.
Yeah, that's. I think that's fair.
All right. If nothing else, we are fair on this show. All right, let's hit it one more time. If it hits Robbie, I'm going to go through the wall.
Oh, who's that? That was CX Kev.
CX Kev. All right. I won't spin it again. I promise. Yeah. Congratulations, CX Kev. You win the $50 to fifthgeargarms.com, and you get to pick which team name you will change for next week. And then Robbie, sorry we couldn't give it to you 2 weeks in a row, but you do get to pick one of our team names to change. All right. Rob, do you want to start prepping your shoe situation?
Do you want to bring the polls up now, Adam, just to look in what the...
Yeah, I'm over on your lineup right now, so I'm going to have to do a little scrolling down to where those polls were.
I've pinned a bunch of different tweets, so it is a bit of a dog's breakfast over on... Okay. I think we have a unanimous verdict for... Or not unanimous,
firm winners on beer and boot.
Boot. Okay, well, let's see what we've got here. Boot, and I pulled this beer out of the fridge an hour ago, so it's going to be awfully lukewarm now. And 7 minutes, 7 minutes until the deadline. So get those teams in pronto, guys. Oh, where's my camera? There we go. Just making sure I'm right in front of the camera for this. I'm going to move my mic just out of the way a little bit, so bear with me. Oh, I've never done this. Never done this to a live audience before. So, boot. Hang on. Let's get the tongue out of the way here. We don't want any DNFs on this one. Oh, this smells terrible. Hang on, Adam. Have you muted yourself, or am I?
Yes, I did mute myself. Maybe it's better that I kept my commentary to myself.
Okay, so we're empty. This is, see if the camera, that's it.
Rob going from yard work to a shoey in them things. Look at that.
This is going to be miserable. All right, bottoms up, guys. May the best fantasy driver for the weekend win. All right.
Rob, I'm really impressed with how clean that turned out. You didn't dump the whole thing down you. That was tremendous.
Oh, there's actually more in there than I thought, so I've just spilled it all down my front. But cheers for the nomination. Please like the stream if you enjoyed what you saw. But that was pretty disgusting. So
and make sure you wash that.
Wash the shoe, yes. And my shirt too. I was surprisingly clean though, so I agree. I usually spill everywhere. So clearly,
if anyone hasn't heard the shoey story from P1 with Matt and Tommy, they were doing shoeys whenever they hit a certain number of subscribers on Twitch, and Matt didn't wash his shoe, and he got very, very sick in the middle of his shoey brigade.
Yeah, that's not sitting too well with me, but I'll manage.
Okay.
But yeah, thanks for everyone that voted on the shoey and the choice of drink. We'll have to think of another wager for the remainder of the season to hopefully have something like that. Something again prior to Abu Dhabi. But yeah, any kind of final comments on this weekend, Adam?
No, I think it's just going to be a crapshoot the whole time. You have high winds, sand, a high evolution track, drivers racing there for the first time. Alpine's brought the biggest upgrades of everyone. Is Pierre Gasly going to stun us this week? A lot of excitement up ahead. So thank you all very, very much for coming to our live stream. We're doing it each and every race just because of the great engagement we have from all of you. So thank you. Please keep it up and enjoy the race.
Well, good luck, guys. Looking forward to seeing what the Carnage, a sprint race weekend, will deliver.